So good morning from me, and you've already been introduced to our panel, but it's a pleasure to welcome again prominent journalist Kamal Ahmed, currently co-hosting the Daily Tea podcast at The Telegraph. You're also Director of Audio there at The Telegraph as well. Munira Mirza, CEO of Civic Future, and Lindsay Stewart joining us from Morningstar Analytics. Ben is joining us for the panel discussion as well to keep us on track. We'll have some time for questions from you, so please do have a think as we go along about what you would like to ask our panel on this topic. But let's start, I think, perhaps with the media, because it's difficult to ignore, I think, the media's role in this issue around polarization. And Kamal, perhaps I can start with you. Over the time that you've been a journalist, you'll have seen the media landscape change beyond recognition almost, from fewer trusted outlets to multi-platform proliferation, long form to short form, and of course the rise of social media. How much do you think that is responsible for an increase in polarization? Or is there something else at play here in the way that discourse and discussion plays out in public?
Well, thanks, Jonathan. I think there is something else going on. I think that the media operates at a certain level which has spotted that passions, I would call it, rather than maybe polarizations, people who passionately follow issues tend to engage with the media and therefore are more valuable to us. And the media has taken a greater recognition of the types of audiences that will really connect with what it argues about. And if you look at The Guardian on one side of the political divide and The Telegraph on the other side of the political divide, we have certainly become more passionate about the issues that engage our audiences. And that is why you've seen a new edge to the way that things are covered. But that edge only comes because our audiences have changed. So I just want to look at this in a slightly different way, and I think it is useful for all of us. What we're seeing actually now is a breakdown in consensus. We've had a 20th century moving into a 21st century where ideas that were seen as the settled view have stopped being seen as the settled view, and the way of expressing disruptive opinions is now much easier. So the means of creation of content and the means of distribution has completely changed through the internet and then social media. That has meant that the established worldview has been broken down more and more rapidly. Now, I think this is a positive thing. This means now I feel that the public feel more heard, that after the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, the idea of simple trust in institutions broke down. The second most important duty of government, once it's looked at our security, is to ensure that it looks after our money. And the financial crisis put in people's minds that the government and the regulators and the banking system were unable to look after our money. There was a moment when there was a threat that we would not be able to withdraw our own money from banks. Now, from that moment, the whole trust mechanism in authority started breaking down. And because of social media and the means of distribution, it was very clear that that was happening. And I think what you've actually had now from that is more of a plethora of opinions, which can be a positive thing. Now, we look at the macro level, the 30,000 feet level, and it all feels quite anxious and scary, and everyone's arguing, and it's all very, very, very difficult to navigate. Actually, if you look at the data around what people think at the lower level, the micro level, myself, my community, my family, people are much more positive. So I think you've got to understand where the public actually is and not just where the media and the political debate is. And if you look at there, that's much more of a positive aspect. And I think corporates have to be always, businesses have to be always careful. Who are they speaking to and why are they speaking to them? I think there are a couple of things, Ben, from the work you've done. I love this idea of collaboration. You have to be so thoughtful in spaces. But we had a high watermark with the death of George Floyd, where businesses seem to go through a sort of psychological mind position where they felt the absolute need to have to speak on the issues of racial injustice. And the reason for that was it was like a cork coming off a bottle. And suddenly, through this breakthrough moment, which so often happens in big issues, people really understood that within my organization, within my communities and with my audiences, there's a big problem here. And so we had this outpouring of, we need to change. But that was a high watermark for a very, very good reason, but it has passed. And my sense is, Jonathan, that corporates now need to not add energy to the tornado, need to realize that X is not the world, need to focus on their values, and I would suggest be very careful of the high moral tone, and also, if I say this, how much of my audience, whether it's if I'm business to business or if I'm business to retail, how much of my audience won't agree with this position? If you look at Arla, and you look at the famous one when Bud Light used a trans person to advertise its beer, if you are putting yourself in a position where an audience can decide that you are saying, therefore, part of your audience is wrong on an issue, that I think is where you're getting into problems. So I think it is, don't panic, depoliticize your messaging. We are not in the George Floyd world anymore. And be aware that identities are no longer left-right. They're much more fluid. And I can both agree and disagree with some of the climate change policies. I can agree and disagree with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And all these things are very complex within us. And businesses that understand how the conversation is changing into the 21st century, I think will be the ones that are successful.
Lots to think about there. Thank you, Kamal. So if X is not the world and left and right is not the beginning and the end of the story, Munira, perhaps I can come to you. You left your role as Director of Policy at Number 10 in a time of particularly highly charged political debate when Boris Johnson was in Number 10. Do you think politicians are still operating in that lens of the social media bubble and left versus right, or is there hope for perhaps a more nuanced discussion and debate?
Well, I wouldn't look to politics for nuance and balanced reasoned debate necessarily. Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me to come today. I think the report is very interesting. There's lots of useful insights into it. And I agree with a lot of what Kamal has said about the nature of polarization today, which I think affects politicians, but also the wider society that they're operating in. By its nature, politics is polarizing. People have very strong opinions. They disagree, sometimes quite violently. Although, actually, when you work in politics, lots of MPs across the aisle work together on select committees. They're often more collaborative than you would imagine when you're watching on television. But I think what has changed in the last decade, certainly, and longer, is that the nature of difference and disagreement is more, as Kamal says, passionate and moralized. So we have a political landscape where people feel extremely strongly about their opinion, often not because they're more politically knowledgeable or engaged. In fact, political knowledge and reading and engagement with policy issues has probably gone down, if we're honest. But people are often, and this is sort of supported in the academic research, particularly from the US but also in the UK, people are very motivated by negative feelings towards their opponents. And so there's a slight difference between feeling very strongly about an issue and then disliking the people who disagree with you versus disliking the people who disagree with you, and therefore that makes you feel very strongly about a political issue. And I think that's what we're getting now. And that means that the character of politics feels more tribal. There is more division over political differences, this is suggested by the academic research, than there is over racial or religious differences. Which is extraordinary. You think, for millennia, human beings have been fighting religious wars. Western liberal democracies in the last 30 years have stopped caring mostly about religion, apart from a few exceptions. Mostly, we don't argue over religious identities anymore, but we do argue over politics. And we feel it very strongly. The level of discrimination over political difference is actually quite high and quite overt. So if you talk to, for example, academics in US universities, many of them will be quite open and say, we do not recruit conservatives in our department. And they don't feel any kind of inhibition about admitting that. It might have changed now because of Trump, but that has been a kind of understood moral position. And so what's happening is that people are adopting political identities, having a very moral view about their opponents, not only do I disagree with you, I think you're a bad person because you disagree with me.
Yes.
And that changes the nature of political discourse quite considerably. I would say just a few things in addition to that. A lot of people will blame social media and blame the kind of 24-hour news cycle for that. I think its roots are much deeper. Social media is an accelerant, and it helps when people are mostly online, as most journalists and politicians often are. So they see the world through this very, very polarized landscape. But the roots of this go way back to the 90s, I would argue, with the rise of ESG, DEI policies, which really started in corporate America around the 90s and 2000s. And what these policies did was they created this idea that corporates are moral entities. They can be good and they can be bad. And the positions they take on things, their involvement in political policy areas means that you can judge them in a moral way. Now, there are good reasons why companies got involved in a lot of these issues, global warming as it was known then, wanting to address racial inequality. But it set off this idea and a whole range of policies and workplace kind of structures and staff networks that made companies much more conscious of their political identity. And I think what's happened, as Kamal's already said, is that there's been a breakdown in the consensus over what's morally right and what's morally wrong. For a very long time, a lot of people were told if you were concerned about climate change policies, if you didn't like the DEI policies in your workplace, you were just a bad person. And what we're seeing now is the breakdown of consensus. People saying, actually, I'm not sure I do agree with this definition of microaggressions. I'm not sure if I do think that it's right that this company is doing X. And people are reacting back in a moralized way against what is already quite a moralized landscape. So I would say that the roots of this go way back to beyond social media. And often within organisations, we do a lot of work with people who work in the public and private sector at leadership level. And they will say, part of the problem they have is that their own staff, their own employees are very, very activated by a lot of these issues. So it's not just external stakeholders and media pile-ons, it's what staff are telling them in their workplace, and that's a real problem for them. Just one final thing I'd say. A lot of activists in these spaces are not always logical or consistent. So, arming yourself with facts and trying to persuade people, I think, might work. Collaborating with them could work. But a lot of them are also just acting in bad faith. They're looking for things to be outraged about, and that's a risk. In politics, we're very familiar with that notion that, you talk to people, you try and appease them, and the next day they will turn against you. That is, that is a realist kind of perspective on these things. I would make a case for, in certain circumstances, corporates having studied neutrality. That there are times, as it's been said, where it's right not to have an opinion, or if you believe in something and you want to defend it, you defend it in commercial terms rather than political terms. Because as soon as you get involved in the field of politics, I think you are inviting a lot of scrutiny, and these are often very contested issues amongst consumers and stakeholders. So there is a case for sometimes saying, actually, our opinion on this is not a political or an ethical one.
We don't have to have an opinion.
You don't have to have an opinion.
Yeah, it is possible. Well, thank you, Munira. And that's taken us actually on to Lindsay's territory quite nicely. And you're at the sharp end of how businesses and investors navigate one of the most polarizing of topics, the ESG agenda. When you're advising businesses in terms of how to interact with investors who are coming at things from that perspective, what do you tell them? Because it came to prominence, there was a backlash, ESG in general now, is it on the back foot? Tell us where it sits.
Sure. It's been a complicated decade, I'd say, when it comes to establishing what the corporate position and what investor positions on sustainability and governance themes should be. And I think it's easy to forget just how unusual it has been. If you cast your mind back to the beginning of the 2020s, and we're halfway through them now, just over. Beginning of the 2020s, Kamal mentioned the high watermark on racial justice, but in and around that, we also had a lot of enthusiasm in the corporate and financial sector around COP26, the conscientiousness around climate change that spread through a lot of the business and financial world. In the background, there was also Me Too. There's the COVID lockdowns, which focused a lot of minds on the social impacts of lockdown and the subsequent inflation wave. What was the impact on their people? And that's kind of pushed corporates and investors, a very unusual group to take positions on these kinds of things, into taking positions, publicly stating them, making commitments that I think now they're having a bit of buyer's remorse and thinking, okay, what do we do with this? How do we live up to it? So that's been particularly interesting. I think, it's said a lot in these circles that there is a need for a focus on what your core purpose is, what is your mission, what are your corporate values. But I think it is really, really important now more than ever to think about what that mission, what those values are, but also what the boundaries around them are. What can you affect? What should you be involved in? And what shouldn't you be involved in, particularly amid the polarization we're seeing now? There's a lot that's said about Donald Trump, and I'm not going to add that much to it, but I think it's important to remember that the heavy politicization of a lot of issues, including DEI, which we've mentioned, including climate change. Firstly, it's a complete repudiation from what went before, where there was a lot of considerable backing for being involved in these issues by the previous administration in the US, which was cheered by a lot of people around the world, not everybody, but certainly in a lot of the corporate and financial circles in Europe and the UK, were very enthusiastic and remain enthusiastic for action on a lot of those topics. Now that's completely reversed into hostility in the United States. A lot of corporates and investors are scrambling for what the answer is and what they do about it. So that's one form of polarization that I think businesses and investors have had to contend with. But another that is spoken about a lot less is the underlying principles on which business is conducted in the US versus a lot of the rest of the world, and particularly in the UK and Europe. And it does revolve a lot around what is the interpretation of fiduciary duty, both for corporates and for investors. And for the longest while, and even up to now, in the US, it's been a focus for corporates on delivering returns for shareholders as their primary objective, set by a Supreme Court judgment back in the 1970s, but they've held on very closely to that. And there's a lot of huge Jenga tower of regulation and law that's built on top of that principle. That doesn't really exist in Europe and the UK in the same way at all. In the UK, you've got Companies Act 2006, Section 172, that encourages businesses to have regard for wider societal and environmental issues. In the same way in Europe, even now you've probably heard a lot about the CSRD directive, which has a double materiality focus. It has an embedded focus on financial outcomes and on societal and environmental outcomes. It's really, really important to recognize just how difficult it is to reconcile that view on this side of the Atlantic with the corporate view on the other side of the Atlantic. And how do you serve all of your stakeholders in and amongst that? Particularly in the US, where there is such high participation in financial markets by retail investors, who are the very targets of the kind of polarization and politicization that we've seen. So it certainly hasn't been easy, but I think corporates and investors are trying to pick a way to really, really find out what is the extent of their influence in social and environmental issues and what the limits are, and really try to explain that to their stakeholders in a way that helps preserve their business.
No easy task.